Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, I know I promised 2 episodes last week, but work got the better of me, and I figured it was better to hold off than to rush out a second episode and then have to scramble to get a show ready for this week and, kind of catch myself up in all the craziness. If it makes you feel better, I did beat myself up about it, even though, of course, absolutely no one was affected by this decision in any way, shape, or form. But that's just me and my eager-to-please self, I guess. Now, I wrote about it in last week's newsletter, but not everybody gets that, so I want to update you from last week's somewhat weird downer of an episode, which came out the morning that I turned 50. I wound up having the best birthday of my life, courtesy of my one true love, who spent weeks putting together this wonderful celebration for me behind my back and lying to me in the process. But, I'll forgive her all that because it was wonderful. It started at lunchtime, basically, with a cake that was made to look like a stack of some of my favorite books, including The Leopard, Stefan Zweig's novellas, Charles Portis's Norwood, Gould's Book of Fish by Richard Flanagan, and a bunch of others. Looked exactly like them. It was a raspberry almond cake with this fondant coating, I guess, to replicate those books. There was also a plate of hat-shaped cookies, each bearing quotes from my favorite movie, Miller's Crossing. And that was all put together by 2 Teaspoons, this bakery that Amy's done photography for here in New Jersey. I just don't want you thinking she's actually that accomplished of a baker. She loves cooking much more than baking, but anyway, it's neither here nor there. The thing was, over lunch, also Bucco and Polenta, she played me this video that she had put together of remembrances from my old friends, plus my brother and my cousin. And in between the tributes were a ton of old photos, a lot supplied by my mom from my first birthday onwards, including some hilarious ones from my college years. Not hilarious because of some crazy frat scenario or anything, just hilarious because I look even funnier than I do now. Anyway, the video just floored me. Reading and hearing all those people talking about our history and what they thought of this weird guy wandering into their lives and the ways that I touched them and reciprocally, all the things they've meant to me over the years when I'd read about these or read their recollections of it all. I couldn't believe she'd put that much work into celebrating my 50th birthday, which is something I was sort of downplaying. And I somehow managed to feel both loved and ashamed, I guess, which is a pretty weird combo, I admit. But it was a wonderful day, and I'm awfully happy to be married to the one person who gets me like this. So, like I wrote in that newsletter, I hope you get to experience this sort of love in your lives. And now, on with the show. Mark Wunderlich is joining us this week. He has a brand new collection of poems out called God of Nothingness from Grey Wolf Press. I enjoyed the hell out of it. Maybe it reflects the title, but the poems are largely stark and haunting. And they're deeply personal, even or largely autobiographical in parts, but they're never esoteric or obscure. I loved just reading them aloud and letting the language flow into a sort of story, from his childhood on a Midwest farm to his poem about meeting Jeffrey Dahmer in a gay bar, which we don't get into in this conversation, but we did talk about after the mics were off. It's a really neat one, too. But anyway, there are a couple of prose poems in the book about Mark's travels to Iceland, Sweden, and Finland. And those two, they're just gold. Above all, these poems feel like a celebration of a self, starting with the one about the name Wunderlich. But all those particularities of biography and queer identity, they somehow resonate in our common soul, getting beyond the specifics into the universal of our lives. I loved God of Nothingness, and I hope you give it a read. And overall, I found Mark pretty fascinating and enjoyed the heck out of this conversation. Now here's Mark's bio. Mark Wunderlich is the author of The Anchorage, which received the Lambda Literary Awards, Voluntary Servitude, and The Earth Avails, which received the Rilke Prize. He is the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the Civitella Ranieri Foundation, and elsewhere. He is the director of the Bennington Writing Seminar's graduate writing program and lives in New York's Hudson Valley. His new book is God of Nothingness, Poems. Oh, yeah, next week's return guest, Sven Berkertz, is the previous director at Bennington's MFA, and that's actually how I first came to learn about Mark and his poetry. It's a weird sequence having them on back-to-back, but life's funny like that. There's also a more extensive version of Mark's bio at his website, markwunderlich.com. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Mark Wunderlich. The Zoom question gets me to the sort of a thing I wanted to ask based on one of the last poems in the new collection. How much of what we are is what is seen?
Mm.
It's a question you put in I believe, the poem on autobiography, and it's one that has been preying on me since I read it, and obviously long before that.
Yeah.
It just hadn't been articulated, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it's a question... it's a very real question, I think, in a poem that was meant to look at what it is. There's so much talk now about identity, I mean, we're in an era of the sort of politics of identity, where, literature is about identity. People need to kind of make declarations of their identity. There are false identities that are out there. And now that we're living in a kind of, a sort of Zoom shadow world in some ways, and I think I found myself certainly asking that question. And that poem, of course, predates the pandemic when I wrote it, but I was very interested in this idea of, what are we talking about when we mean that? It's come to be a shorthand for so many things, but I really wanted to use it as an opportunity to ask a question about what are we actually talking about when we mean our identity.
Yeah, and to that extent, now God of Nothingness is the only collection of yours that I've read, so I don't know how much it permeates your previous poems, but that sense of autobiography and the uses of oneself as the starting material, I guess, and how you extend that out to I won't say the universal, but the common aspects of our lives. How important is that balance, I guess, that need to bring in the autobiographical details of oneself?
It's interesting. I've been asked that in the kind of lead up for the publication of this book. I've been asked that a number of times, and even my editor has referred to the book as kind of fiercely autobiographical. And I guess that my relationship to autobiographical material, I first of all, I think that everything that we have is part of our own subjectivity. I mean, everything, how else do we experience the world but through ourselves, right? Everything that we take in, everything we know, sort of funnels through this, whatever it is we are. And I guess that, I think of, we're in this moment. Americans have this obsession with these fine differences between fiction and nonfiction, between the fictional and the autobiographical.
Sure.
All of these sorts of things that are parsed and sorted out and talked about and categorized. But it's hard for me to think of any writing as being anything other than some sort of fiction. I mean, that when we're constructing a version of ourselves in print, when we're writing, when we're using that first person pronoun, how can the first person pronouns actually stand in as a representative of selfhood, with all that we are, all that we know, all that we have done and experienced, our memories, our bodies, the culture that we inhabit, that inhabits us, all of those things. How can that actually be represented by one single letter that we put, that we print on a page? And I think too, there is such a very American insistence on truthfulness when we think of things like, particularly nonfiction. I remember the spectacle of Oprah calling the,
You just say James Fry,
James Fry, and to onto her show to take him to task for making up details in his memoir, and also his editor. That was actually the most interesting part of it, was to see his editor there too, being asked to answer for that, and publishers instituted policies of fact checking and all kinds of things as a result of that. But I found it kind of amazing that that's what the expectation was. The expectation of James Fry was that what he was doing was going to be absolutely truthful because we called it nonfiction. Now, I think what he did was probably pretty specious, and it's a sensational book, and he wanted to, make it more sensational. But when I think about poetry, I will also say, I sound like I'm sort of hedging here right now in terms of the vis-a-vis my own book. But what I have to say is that the things that I write about in the book did indeed happen. But there are all kinds of things in the book that also happened that I did not write about. And what about those? If you're trying to get a big picture of a kind of complete picture, it's impossible to capture the complete picture of experience in literature.
I mean, I think of it as a mosaic, and in some respects, we're I don't want to say trusting you, but the pieces are there, the reader is there to assemble them into, assemble fragments into something that resembles a person, I guess.
Well, that I think is what you're describing, is the actual pleasure of reading a book of poetry. I think that the character that one is, when you read a novel, you experience characters. When you're reading a work of nonfiction, there's the narrative voice is the person there. And when you're reading a book of poems, the thing that you're constructing is a character, and that character is the poet. It's your idea of the poet, of the person that has created these poems. I mean, I would say that my books of poems are me at my most articulate, at my most sensitive, at my most, at my most intelligent. And then there's the rest of me that's just bumbling about like everybody else. You know what I mean? Like it's a heightened form of expression. It's a heightened version of the self that one is creating in those situations, and the pleasure that a reader derives is what they are then imagining the poet to be, and that's the character that one is creating in a book of poems. It is allied with the self. It's allied with me. The experiences I'm writing about are are experiences that I've undergone, and it's things that I know and have done and have seen. But it's, I don't find it. I think of Dickinson saying, when I state myself as representative of the verse, I do not mean me, but a supposed person. And she, in all of her poems, she was experimenting with variations of near and far, things close to the self, held close to the chest, and those things that were, pushed some distance away. And I think that a poet is often using tone and, a kind of different degrees of narrative closeness and distance that portray the self in different ways.
How long did it take you to learn that, or to develop that, I suppose?
Well,
was it something that you sort of developed in your student years, or something you sort of came to the conclusion of over the course of writing?
I in my very first book, which I wrote in my 20s, and I was published in the sort of last minutes of my 20s. I think it was 29 when it came out. And I remember the kind of exact moment where I wrote the first poem that became the first good poem for that book. And it was sort of a revelation to me. And my first book was very much about the experience of having grown up in the Midwest and then moving to New York City. And I did that when I was, 21, and I had graduated from college, and I moved to New York, and it was 1991, and I moved into the East Village, into an apartment I shared with two friends. And it was the height of AIDS deaths in New York City. And it was the sort of peak of that crisis. And I moved from the Midwest to a place where, that was in an absolute crisis. And it was a real revelation. And I wrote about my experience of kind of, moving to New York City to kind of find my life, to find my people, to make the life for myself that I wanted and that I had so longed for. Only to find that I had moved into the middle of a war zone. And, and it was really, really sobering. And so I started writing about it, and I found myself asking questions about what am I going to reveal and what am I going to conceal? What am I going to claim as my story? What's the story that belongs to someone else? I asked myself a lot of those questions as it was happening. And, I guess that so many of the poets I was drawn to when I first really became serious about writing poems were poets who were minding their own lives. But I guess I never saw it as a kind of declaration of, Sylvia Plath is a poet who is much more a poet of kind of grand mythology than she is of autobiography. That, the autobiography you glean from that work is just scraps compared to the kinds of, the
mythos.
Yeah, the sort of mythos that she creates, which is magnificent, which is the real achievement of that work. So.
And I think of someone like Merrill. Keep in mind also, I'm a poetry moron, but I did read Langdon Hammer's Merrill biography and then started on Merrill and all that. But, sort of the veiledness of his life versus the poems, I guess. And that ties into gay life in that era leading up to the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, Merrill is a really important poet and figure for me. I knew him a little bit. I spent some time with him not that long ago. I was actually a resident at the James Merrill House in Stonington, where I spent 3 months living and working in what had been, his home there. And he's a poet who, he was so important in my early education. He was kind of held up as this example what it really meant to be a poet. But there were things about him too that I found, you know, off-putting, unattainable,
Hmm.
and mostly it was the kind of incredible class privileges that he was granted, and and the kind of education that he had also just sort of taken for granted, the kind of ways in which he was able to move through the world. Now, that said, the man was so incredibly generous. He could have lived much more grandly than he did. And he chose not to. He quietly gave money away to people who needed it. He was, as generous a friend as anyone could have, and was also living really a kind of radical life in a lot of ways. And his terrific, autobiography that he wrote, the memoir that he wrote, A Different Person, is I think should be a must read for any kind of gay autobiography class, because it's really about, he sort of asks the question, I grew up with a silver spoon in my mouth, and like, why am I unhappy?
Yeah.
And it's a really magnificent book, and one that demonstrates tremendous self-knowledge. So
Yeah, it's a question I'd had throughout, reading that Langdon's memoir, or sorry, his biography of him, and trying to reconcile the level of privilege with the actual work, with the idea that if I came from that much money, I'm not sure I would have devoted my life to that degree of art and have done everything that he managed to do.
he worked incredibly hard. It was absolutely,
Yeah.
he was so devoted to his work as a poet. And, having lived in that house, having lived in that apartment, it's a really modest place. I have to say, and that's the thing that I loved the most about him in some ways, is that it's very eccentric. It's really, he kind of made this place to look like the inside of his head or something. It was his own. It was inelegant. It's not particularly lovely. It's wildly eccentric. It's all about books and music and creating a place for friends to come and hang out. The house itself, is this in the middle of this small town, which is, the sort of wasp elephant graveyard of,
Yeah, Sandy McClatchy pointed it out to me when I recorded with him. He took me outside to show me where it was, but yeah.
So
it's a great description.
Sandy was my teacher, and that's really why I met Meryl, and I mean it's this, the most amazing detail that were the other people who he moved into that building after he bought the building. It was described, I think, I remember, people in town referring to this man who lived in the apartment downstairs, and and I think he was sometimes Meryl's lover, sometimes his drug dealer, sometimes, a pimp, I mean, he did all kinds of things. And there was one person in town, and they said, oh, that was Jimmy's, well, he was Jimmy's concierge. And I thought that was like a really, there's still people in Stonington. I don't know how long has he been dead now. They're still gossiping about him. I mean, James Merrill was the most interesting thing that ever happened in Stonington, Connecticut. And, that he and his partner had this boyfriend in Greece who they move into the building. They like bring him, over from Greece with his wife and children. And he moves into the downstairs apartment and also moves goats in, like he was keeping goats in the basement of this thing. I just think that this man was living this incredibly radical life, and he was doing it in many ways on his own terms. Now, he was able to do that in part because he just had a whole lot of money, and he could insulate himself from all kinds of things as a result of that. But that said, he really didn't care, I mean, he seemed to, at least, to kind of occupy that space with a a sort of ferocious intent to live his life the way he wanted to.
Yeah.
And I just, he's he's a hero of mine in many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a thing that's come up, especially as I've interviewed older gay authors or queer authors and guys around our age. I'll be 50 next week. I think you're right around or slightly older.
I'm 52. Yeah.
Oh, old timer. And then, much younger people, that sense of not knowing what the history was and, as wonderful. It's like when I asked Sandy in our conversation, did you think back when you got fired from Yale for teaching gay literature, did you ever think you were A, going to get married to a man, B, that it would be on the front page of the New York Times style section? And he said, I wouldn't have thought that in 2008, much less 1978. He said just the way the times changed and what the younger people don't have to go through, is phenomenal. But at the same time, that sense of, making some sort of art out of the codedness of language, I guess, and who you could be back then versus, who you can be now. That's all stuff I find compelling as an outsider to all that, but still.
Yeah. I mean, it's this, I think, my queerness is so bound up with being a poet in the first place. I mean, that these things for me are inseparable. And I remember, McClatchy, who was very wanted to kind of introduce me to the world of gay writers, and he introduced me to all kinds of people, to Gore Vidal and to Merrill and to William Meredith and just all kinds of people. He wanted to sort of give me access to that world, but he was also he also, I remember him warning me. He said, like, don't let yourself be categorized as a gay writer. He said that and he said you want to be better than that. Now, I took that in, but I didn't actually. I thought he's giving me what he thinks is very good advice, but I was looking around at the world I was living in, and I thought, yeah, I don't know that I'm not gonna. I can't do that. I can't.
Yeah.
I can't follow that advice. I don't know how I would not do that. I didn't know how it was both possible to write about oneself and one's experience with sort of frankness and openness, and avoid categorization in that way. And besides, it's not up to me. It's if we're talking about agreeing to be in an anthology or something like that, that's minor. But I think he was thinking of something bigger than that. And I thought, yeah, I don't know that that's going to be my path. And while I appreciated the kind of care that I think he was exercising, and extending to me, I also couldn't do what he was suggesting because I didn't know how to.
Right. And I think, again, some of that seems to be generational. And that raises a question, and this is getting way far afield of God of Nothingness, but as long as we're talking, it came up for me, it came up in Fran Lebowitz's documentary by Scorsese, where she talked about the impact of AIDS on culture, gay culture, especially in New York.
Yeah.
And that sense of what you were talking about with Sandy, that sense of, we'll say, mentoring or shepherding, and why opera and ballet and everything were so critical, and why it helped to have an older generation bringing younger people into that world, and how that all got disrupted in the 80s. As entire generation gets wiped out, and you arrive right after that. Did you still feel that you had that sort of bridge, generationally, or when you talk to older, particularly older gay men or artists, that sense that you sort of had to invent that or create that for yourself?
Well, it was a really, Leibowitz is very funny about this subject, actually, where she has a sort of great quote, and to any listener out there who hasn't seen that documentary, she's very, wickedly funny about it, and I appreciate that. I guess what I would, that world when I look back at that period of, excuse me, at that period of time in the 90s, um, it was really an awful time, you know. We've just sort of, we're passing out of, you know, the Trump era, but the Reagan era was
Yeah.
another disaster, you know, and that um, it was, you know, first of all, the very first generation of kind of out gay identified men were then struck down by this disease. And so, you know, there is this sense that as I look around at my kind of peer group now, at sort of men in their 50s, there are many fewer gay men in their 60s, you know, and even fewer of them in their 70s, because that generation was so devastated by this you know, this just a disease of that, you know. I mean, now we're in another pandemic, and I'm looking at this and thinking, how many more pandemics am I going to live through? You know, or I mean, AIDS really was an epidemic, not a pandemic, but it was, you know, it's that these diseases have shaped so much of my life experience. I feel like there was certainly some, you know, initiation into that world. I think, you know, my very first week in New York when I moved there, and I, you know, fell off the turnip truck in Manhattan with, you know, after having managed to save $700. That is a literal story. That, you know, that I had $700 in my pocket, and I thought, I'll be fine. What could go wrong? I have $700, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's,
They'll go on forever in New York.
this is great. And but that very first week, I met Allen Ginsberg. You know, when I moved to, when I arrived, and I just thought, oh well, this is all possible. You know, you can kind of come into this world and meet these figures, and in that way, it was as I had hoped. But on the other hand, I was also present when, you know, the artist David Wojnarowicz, when he died and his body was carried through the streets in the East Village, you know, and I remember too when, you know, the East Village was, Tompkins Square Park had been closed and there had been riots,
Yeah.
and a tank was driven down 13th Street, you know, because there was so much crack happening in the neighborhood, and the neighborhood was becoming increasingly violent. But the, you know, the city, like a tank, they drove a tank down the street in New York. I was there seeing that. It was unbelievable. Um, and so you know, I'm jumping around here, but I think about how during our current pandemic, people keep talking about things being unprecedented. And I keep thinking, what do you mean unprecedented? The whole
Yeah.
history of the world, of humanity, has been one of plagues and, you know, and violence in the streets. And so what precedent do you think is original? You know, I mean,
Right.
um, so, anyway, I think,
But that's our. Oh, sorry. Go
well,
ahead.
yeah, there was certainly mentorship, and there certainly was a bridge to another world, but it was a bridge that was on fire, and that is, you know, was that really marked my experience,
Yeah.
as well. You know, um, yeah, I was also there. You know, I was also in New York to see this kind of early flowering of literature and art and culture responding to that disease. And I remember the billboards of, you know, Felix Gonzalez Torres that went up around neighborhoods all over. It was this sort of an empty bed with, you know, two pillow prints, head prints on two pillows, and it was an elegy for his lover who had died. I remember seeing that in my neighborhood that went up. You know, I was at an early performance of Angels in America. Um, you know, I remember seeing, you know, the art, the street art of David Wojnarowicz, seeing the, you know, the graffiti art of others that was happening around the city. And it was a really, you know, meeting Paul Monette, who was writing about AIDS, knowing Mark Doty, who was, you know, one of the first people to write a memoir about those losses, and his, you know, tremendous book, Maya Alexandria, which is still a real, I think, a masterpiece of poetry about that experience, and many, many others, that too became the bridge to this other generation. It was happening through the culture that they were making rather desperately in an effort to document and preserve and mark this experience before the worst could happen. So that was, that was my experience. That, I think, of becoming, becoming a poet, and also thinking about the responsibility of autobiography, of not being hidden, of examining the self and the lived life, and not being ashamed of it in any way. And that, I think, was really important, and a lesson I learned, I think, from that time period.
Yeah, in that sense, do you recall you mentioned the revelatory aspect with the particular poem, but that sense of transcending the influences that you had?
Well, yeah.
Were there ones that you saw as formal influences that you had to grow beyond, I guess?
Yeah, I think so. I remember people talking a lot about, I mean, my education. So I ended up going to Columbia University, and there I studied with these poets, many of them who were, gay men who were also these tremendous formalists. At the time there was Alfred Korn and J.D. McClatchy and Richard Howard. They were all at Columbia, and they're these real geniuses of the tradition of the art form. And I remember so many people kind of upholding Elizabeth Bishop as the example of the person to whom one should aspire. And I remember Sandy talking about Elizabeth Bishop and James Merrill as his two kind of touchstones, the two poets that meant the most to him. But I also was, often hearing people praising the work of Elizabeth Bishop for its restraint, right? The thing that everyone congratulated her for posthumously was her wonderful restraint. Isn't she so beautifully restrained? Mm-hmm. And I kept thinking about that word and, wondering, like, why is a poem a thing, is a place where you have to be restrained? Is that the ideal, restraint? What were they really talking about when they mean that? What they were talking about, what she was being, was living a queer life without making anyone see it. For me, while Bishop is an absolute genius and that work is, a touchstone for me, I also find it tremendously painful work, because for me, it's the sort of literature of the closet. It is absolutely this kind of place in which she is both concealing and revealing, but very often she's concealing. And that she had to basically live in exile most of her life. Now, she had a lovely life in Brazil in many ways, but she was cut off from family and friends, a language, and living out of the country in order to live the kind of life that she wanted to live. That's what she did. She moved abroad. And we know her story as sometimes a tragic one, but I think it's also a story of course, tremendous achievement, tremendous artistic achievement. But I think when one of the questions I had to ask is, is poetry a place where you want to be restrained, or is a poem a place where you actually get to exercise some freedom? We all know that we can't be fully free in our lives, in our lived lives. We have responsibilities, there are various constraints on it. But I keep thinking of the poem as an environment, a kind of created environment in which one should be able to exercise and explore one's own freedom. And that can be a freedom of imagination, of expression, of, to say what is ugly and simultaneously ugly and beautiful about the world and about your life. It's a place to fantasize. It's a place of conjecture. And mostly for me, I think it's a place of questions. And that I want it to be a poem, to be a place of the free exploration of questions about what it is to be a human being in this world. And 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 so thinking of kind of casting off influences, I've certainly thought about that. I also have, in thinking about James Merrill's work, for me, the I love so many of his poems, but I also find, except for the Book of Ephraim, I find the long book, in which he and his partner were using the Ouija board, The Changing Light at Sandover, which is this epic book. I find it almost unreadable.
Yeah.
It is a book of such, I'm all for erudition, but it's a book of it's so strangely self-aggrandizing, and it's, I don't know, it's just, I just think for me it's an unreadable book. Like I can't absorb it. The first section that he wrote, it's the first part of it called the Book of Ephraim, I think is actually, a work of genius. I think it's quite wonderful. But then he kept going for years and years and years, and so, I saw that as a kind of cautionary tale as well, like, don't
Yeah.
stay off the Ouija board, it's not that interesting.
Yeah.
So
It's a question actually that I've only taken up poems in recent years. I actually have to send you a copy of the zine I put out in 2020 called Haiku for Business Travelers. It's not just haiku, it's actually all sorts of oddball stuff. But the question that occurred to me in the process of putting that together, and when I've asked one or two poets since, when is a poem done? Yeah. Or is one ever done, or do you just stop working on it for the sake of the collection?
Well, that's the old saw about that a poem is never finished, it's just abandoned. And I guess I think, a poem is done. Really, I remember seeing Galway Cannell in a bookstore down by NYU, and I saw him pick up a copy. I will admit I was following him around the bookstore a little bit. I was young and a little starstruck, and I remember seeing him, and he literally pulled a book off the shelf, his own, and took out a pencil and changed something and put it back on the shelf. And I thought, I have two thoughts, about that. I guess one is like admiration. The other is it might be time to let it go. I mean,
I used to publish Samuel R. Delany. I don't know if you know Delany.
Yeah.
Okay. Chip, as he's known, literally would put index cards with corrections into every copy of Dahlgren he could find. When I was publishing him, I was at my old day job, he would call 10 to 15 times a day with corrections to a chapbook that we were doing as a free giveaway with his letters. So yeah, I can understand that impulse, but still, yeah, you're right. Let it go.
I mean, you want to, I think with a poem, you want to get it right. You really want the poem to be, at its best, it's a very exacting form, and it's something that's meant to kind of stave off change in some way. I mean, that the poem is trying to kind of fix something in time, and along a kind of axis of the self's movement through the world, and plus time, you get a poem, and I think that there's if you feel as though there's something that you can fix, you might want to fix it. I do know other people who've sort of gone back into their early work and revised it. Auden was famous for this. Sort of he turned against a lot of his early work, that he edited poems that he had written 20, 30 years earlier, and not always, I think, to their advantage. I think part of what you have to do is acknowledge that there are earlier versions of yourself in which you wrote the best poems you were capable of writing at that moment in time. And you need,
that raises,
forgive yourself for having been young, and move on. So,
well, it raises the question with God of Nothingness, which I have to assume poems were written before we entered pandemia for the most part. how did the 2020 mark go back or correct or otherwise revise pre-pandemic poems for a collection coming out in January 2021?
Yeah.
Because that the self of this past year for all of us is so different than who we thought we were, or maybe it reveals who we didn't realize we were. But how did it affect looking back at the poems, and did you end up revising or reconfiguring what was going to comprise the collection?
No, I guess I was, actively editing and refining some of these poems. But it was, at the beginning, back in January, I think it was under contract in January, and we were already, a year ago, and we were
Yeah,
already in its, it was entering its final stages. So there wasn't a whole lot that I could, there wasn't a whole lot that happened to the book in terms of changing its content,
mm,
that could even happen anymore. I mean, like book production, it takes a while. It's like a year,
yeah,
of kind of moving it along to that final stage. And Grey Wolf is on a, they are on a schedule, and you don't
sure.
mess with that. So it's, they're, um, uh, and so I guess it didn't change a lot. I suppose my perception of it has changed some as a result of this past year. It's been a year of changing one's expectations of what are kind of hoping for putting a book out in the world. I mean, there's no, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere to read in person. I'm and I
Not welcoming some schlep from New Jersey with a couple of
I
microphones to
mean,
show up
it's
at
not
your
happening.
home.
Yeah, I mean, which I would have, all of which is, the truth is that I love all of that business. I love traveling places and, meeting with students and, giving readings in places. And I love every part of it. And, it takes a while to write a book, and it's, how many of those would you ever get in a lifetime? So I was very much looking forward to it. But it's not happening. So I had to change, I had to kind of figure out what I was going to do. I don't know that it's a book about, much of the book is really about a year of great loss. So
Yeah.
there were 8 people who were close to, in 2018, 8 people I was close to died. And, um, and I also was given the task of selling the family farm in Wisconsin. And my father was dying while that was happening. And my father died at Christmas 2 years ago, and I turned 50, and the day after that, we buried him. So it
Mm.
was, it was one of those years of this, of a kind of wave of things. That was the conclusion of the year. But there had been both of my poetry mentors died, Lucy Brockbroido and Sandy McClatchy, and, I was at those funerals and, kind of contending with that. My old relatives had died. My uncle died, my uh, godparents died, um, and a close friend of mine committed suicide in the spring. Um, a student of mine she was older. She'd been my student at Columbia, and she died very suddenly, um, and unexpectedly with 2 teenage kids, and and we were beginning a friendship. And so it was a really sobering year. And my father was ill, and he had brain cancer, and he finally died at the end of that year. So it was a very heavy time, and and I think that um, this year that we've just completed, and that we're the effects of which we're still thinking about, is going to be one of great, I think, of real mourning for people. We've talked about all of the things that people have lost, in this time, I,
It's like you got a head start, which I know sounds coarse or rude,
well,
but yeah.
I think,
Do you feel it prepared you for some of what we're going through?
I guess I think it, I mean, to be an adult is to learn how to experience loss, right? I think that, later in your life, the big question is often one: how do you keep living while all around you there is loss? Like, where do you find meaning and connection? What do you value? What do you want your life to look like? How do you help other people to realize their own potential and their own capacity for happiness? Those are the important questions, and those are the things that we should be asking, I think, now, after having undergone this. I feel tremendously, in many ways, I feel tremendously lucky to have weathered this year of the pandemic as as um, as I have. I live in the country, in the countryside, in a house upstate New York, and that made it very easy in many ways. My work was uninterrupted, so I didn't have to contend with the kind of loss of income or anything like that. In fact, there was more work in many ways. I like being at home. I don't like. I like my own cooking. I mean, all of these things were sort of advantages, but there was. It's also been a year of tremendous loneliness, and for me and millions of other people around the world, that there was so much that I missed. Like expectations that, of course, aren't going to be happen. But I also have to say, like, this is the world. Like, everyone needs to really grow up and understand that these things, these are the conditions of life on Earth. And this has happened before. Things like this have happened before. We are not alone in that. I think that there's great comfort to be found in looking into the past and seeing how people have weathered these sorts of things. I do feel for, you know, um, young people, particularly, who are uh, trying to find their way, and for whom being among people of their age and socializing is such an important part of how to make a life, and that's not happening is really a pretty bitter pill. I think of the tremendous isolation of old people in nursing homes, and I think about people in prison an awful lot, about how scary it must be in some facility trapped there and to not have confidence that you're going to be kind of protected from this disease. And I think of how terrifying that must be at times. And but this is the world. So I guess if the writing the book, and writing the book certainly did prepare me for, I think, maybe hardship, but who saw this coming? Only virologists and people who studied this, who've been talking about it for decades. They weren't surprised. And but I guess, for me, writing poems about these experiences, I want experience to have meaning. I want the things that we go through in a life to mean something. And you know um, to just experience pain and to have it not have any context, or to lead to some kind of understanding, is a terrible thing. And so I write poems, and poems for me are these ways of taking the lived life and rendering it into something durable, into something that holds my experience away from me, at a certain distance, and allows me to see it. It allows me to aestheticize and to put into language that which is perhaps only felt or experienced, and make it into something that I can actually give to someone else.
Has the seclusion aspect helped in that respect? You're you're not having as much lived experience, because you're not, interacting with people, you're not out in the world. But does that sense of distance, that hiatus, I guess, from the world give you something in terms of being able to reflect on past experience and shape things? Which I guess is also asking, are you writing poems, at present? Not necessarily about pandemia, but yeah.
I have been. I've been writing nonfiction. This last year, despite everything, and maybe in fact because of it, has been a year of tremendous productivity for me. I think part of it is that I'm not going anywhere. I'm home all the time. I've
But does it help in that respect of you can now look back on things without funneling in as much current experience?
I think I'm always looking backward.
Okay.
I think that's, I don't know. mm, I don't know how good I am at actually writing about what's right in front of me. I think it's always like everything is always like it takes 2 years, before I can kind of revisit it and think about it and have some perspective. I think I don't know. I don't know how good. It's I think it's very difficult to write about what's right in front of you often. I think that we're certainly for me it just I'm not that smart about what I'm looking at all the time.
Yeah. I think more in terms of just not being distracted by current ongoing experience and having that quiet around you that enables you to look back more or look back with more
Yeah.
artistic sense. But again, I may be applying a theoretical framework that has no bearing on reality
Well,
for
I
you.
think
So
there's also been this, everyone has talked about the difficulty of concentrating this year. I've certainly had that, but I also think, a lot of that was just a anxiety. There was a tremendous amount of anxiety around our political situation and the election,
sure.
and so much energy that was directed toward that. This has really been quite a year. Just it feels to me, the the both the demonstrations and the riots in Minneapolis, for instance, doesn't that feels to me like it happened 5 years ago, not
Oh yeah.
months ago? I mean, the sense of time during this period is very very strange, and each of those kind of events that we've kind of gone through um, has felt like its own decade almost. That's what's I think so strange about this time.
Yeah. It's one of those things where I try and, well, I've got the show every week, so I could sort of date myself based on, who I was talking to and what I mentioned in the introduction, et cetera. But yeah, there are degrees to which everything feels like it's a decade long. It takes forever to just try to contextualize anything from the past
Yeah.
year.
Yeah. I keep a journal, and I write daily and I note things that have happened and done. It's just a sort of just so I know what I did over the course of
Yeah.
that period of time. And I actually went back, through and looked at this past year, and it's just it's hard to kind of put it all together, everything that can happen, while also not going anywhere.
Yeah.
That how small the kind of my geographical range became. It's I just kind of crossed the bridge between Columbia and Greene counties. That's my big adventure, and is to kind of go back and forth in this area. But the kind of larger and often cataclysmic things that were happening are really something. While also being, just throwing myself into work and just working all the time, and that has been both good and bad. I now see I've often wondered how, kind of looking at writers in the past and seeing how did they write so much in such a short period of time. how did that actually happen? I mean, they died at 50. How is it that they had produced so much? And I think, well, they didn't go anywhere.
And they didn't have social media.
Yeah, they did. They stayed home.
Those two factors really, can eat up a lot of your time.
That's right. Right. They stayed home and they did their work.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to the journal, morning or evening?
Morning.
Same here. And I have friends who say, no, you need to write at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And because if I forget or I don't do it, I beat myself up about it and then it becomes a spiral. If I do it first thing in the morning, it's done in the morning. And you sort of had time to condense everything, I guess.
Yeah. And for me too, I've always sort of written poems in the morning, because it's like a fresh page, it's, there's nothing else competing. And the ideal is to take advantage of that moment before the noise of the world starts up.
Sure. Write longhand or on a computer?
I do write longhand. I write in a notebook and then I type on a typewriter.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I just, I used to compose entirely on a computer. And the thing that I found about that was I lost things and, kind of revising by deleting what you
too easy to edit.
It was too easy, and I felt as though I couldn't see what I had done. I wasn't leaving any tracks, and so I shifted and I started composing in a notebook, and I do that. I'll write multiple drafts on paper and in longhand, and then to see what it's going to might look like if it is in fact going to evolve and become a poem, then I type it on a typewriter. And it's the same reason, is that I don't want to then be revising it. And so then I revise on typed pages and then eventually type it up and begin to manipulate it electronically.
How important is that visual representation of a poem for you?
Well, it's, a poem is also an object, right?
Yeah.
It's also, unlike prose, which is liquid, you can kind of pour it into any vessel and it'll fill the vessel. A poem is much more, it's a lot bossier, it's taking up space. It's kind of elbowing things around it. But I think that, a line of a poem is also a kind of musical composition. It's a line of poetry is creating a relationship between sort of space and sound and meaning. And for me, it's like musical composition. You need to be able to see it. For me, the space, I sometimes look at a poem that's written in a block. And I do write prose poems as well, right? But I'm thinking of sometimes looking at a page of sort of dense poetic language in a block, and I think, I don't want to go in there. I don't want to. Yeah. That's like a thorny thicket, and I don't want to. I'm going to get trapped in there. I like to see sort of light and air around it, but it also kind of allows the language of a poem to be seen, to be kind of to take on increased meaning by isolating it a little bit. And you're also creating a shape on a page. You're also creating something that is visual, and that means something as well. I mean, poems are conveying meaning in tone and sound and what they look like on the page, and in all kinds of ways that are not just about the meaning of the language itself. They're giving, they're producing meaning and information by doing all of these different things.
It's well, a question I have sort of about God of Nothingness in general, both the visual invitingness of so many of the poems, but also you mentioned a couple of prose poems are in there, or prose pieces. I'm not sure how you characterize them. How the organization of the book came together, the structure of it, and how you chose to organize it the way you did.
Well, it's the book is in four sections, and the beginning is a kind of long series of poems that are, they many of them really do address directly specific losses. There are a number of elegies there,
Yeah.
and that began to kind of form itself as a into a into a cohesive group. Um,
Hmm.
and that sequence of poems was for me it feels like the most important thing that I did in the book. Then there are other kinds of poems that I write, and so I wanted to sort of place them in different ways in different places in the manuscript. I really love poems. I love individual poems. I like poems that have integrity in and of themselves, that are complete in and of themselves, and that can be read on their own, independent of what is around them. I also love, book length poems and things like that too, and epic poetry and and all of that. But I love individual poems so much, and I wanted all of what I wrote in this book to be that. I wanted them to each be able to stand alone and to be a kind of independent entity that didn't depend on anything else in order to be read and understood and appreciated. And then when I began composing the book and putting it together, I began to see the ways in which those poems were in conversation with each other, and were able to kind of reinforce and and embolden something that was in another poem, to kind of highlight it and to amplify certain aspects of it. And so then, putting the book together became a question of composing a larger cohesive thing. And there are poems that kind of exist in different categories for me in the book, and in some ways I grouped some of those. Um, and and there are echoes that happen, and I didn't always want those to be side by side. You don't want
Sure.
things that a poem that refers to one thing like exactly next to the other one. Although I think I do that in at least one.
We'll let it slide. It's okay. Is it sort of like the putting together a mixtape, which you're of an age when that's something we used to do.
Yeah, I mean the album, of course, is I think a first place where we begin to recognize, it's it creates our kind of early access to the sense of of something being composed that way, of something being an assembly of parts that becomes something cohesive. And there've certainly been albums that I've listened to where I thought, oh, I want to write a book that has that says,
Yeah.
that does that can do that. And for me, I guess that's in part what putting a collection of poems together is doing.
Now, as long as we're dating ourselves talking about albums, although vinyl is back and everybody's huge with that again, you're doing, or you have been doing, a course on Rilke by physical mail,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
How well did it work, and how tough was it getting younger people to write letters and put them in the mail?
Well, it was not difficult at all.
Yeah.
That was, and I was teaching this at Bennington College, right? So Bennington is 4-year liberal arts college. It is has very strong programs in literature, art, music, etc. It's a place where it's a very artistic place. My students, undergraduate students there, are wildly creative and original minds in many ways, and they elected to take this class because they wanted to write letters. And it was some of the letters that I received from them were absolutely extraordinary. There were some things that were so revelatory about teaching a class this way. So I was slated to teach that, you have to turn in these course descriptions months and months and months in advance. And I was going to be planning on teaching a seminar on Rilke's work in person. And then, the pandemic happened and we were told to prepare to do it remotely. And we were given great latitude by the college to come up with different strategies for doing that. You could do it completely via Zoom, synchronously, or you could teach a class completely asynchronously. And I came up with the idea of, in thinking particularly about Rilke's great book, The Letters to a Young Poet, which, I was wondering, does that still have resonance for people? Is it still being read and appreciated the way it was when I was a young poet starting out, when it was so revelatory and, felt like being struck by lightning reading that book. And I wanted to teach it and give students the opportunity to read it. But also I thought that's the right age to read it. When you're 18, 19, 20, 21, that's, read it now and see if it speaks to you, because that was the age of the young poet who was writing to Rilke, who, by the way, was like all of 29 or 30. I mean, he sounds like this sage on the mountain, but partly because of his sense of himself, I think. But he was a relatively young man when he wrote that. And so I designed this course. I thought, what if we just taught it completely through the mail? Well, the other thing that, of course, I hadn't anticipated was the assault on the U.S. postal system that was happening during this time. So it also became a kind of, in a way, the course became, people rallied around it as a sort of political statement about, there are important things that happen in the mail, and we need to kind of preserve this essential service. So my students embraced it. What was most interesting, I think, was the tone that they struck so naturally, which was one of a kind of a bit of formality. They approached me with a little bit of formality, but also a kind of intimacy, that they really understood this form as being one person writing to another person. And there was in that, what they wrote to me was for my eyes only. And we engaged in a kind of correspondence that was at once, intellectual. I was teaching in the form of letters, but they were writing to me both about the work we were reading, but they were also writing about themselves and about their own experience. They were reflecting on what these poems and prose of Rilke meant to them. And I just found it it was really moving at times to do that, and to be in this kind of deep correspondence. Now, I now direct the Bennington's Low Residency MFA program, which is a whole course of study that's designed on correspondence. It's, you produce work, you send it to your teacher, they have 10 days to write a kind of deep response to it and to send it back to you. It's a whole degree that is conducted in the course of letters. And when I came up with this for the undergraduates, it wasn't a big stretch to take one, convert it to the other. But one of the things that I liked very much about it was composing my own long letters about Rilke's work to the students and sending it to them. There were problems with the mail. The fastest letters I got back and forth so reliably were with a student who was in Poland. Apparently Poland was not trying to dismantle its postal system. That her letters came to me, it was, wow. That was incredible. And, but the whole experience, I think, was really, it was something I would definitely do again. And I was just really, heartened by the intensity and the diligence and the kind of wild intelligence that my students just naturally put into that work. And it was all about the kind of intimacy of that exchange that they just understood from the very beginning. And it made great sense, particularly thinking about Rilke, who,
Nice.
and was in his life was so peripatetic that he, after he was kind of exiled from Paris, it wasn't until because the war had broken out and he'd been living in Paris, and he becomes an enemy alien, right? And so he has to return to Austria.
Hmm.
And he doesn't go back to Paris. He does later on. He travels there, but his library is sold, confiscated and sold. All of his papers, everything that he had owned, the home that he had there, just disappears. And some friends were able to go into his apartment and get a box of things, including like a photograph of his father, and things like that. Like but that's all he had. And he just spends the rest of his life kind of moving around as this sort of society mooch, kind of living in castles and taking out, which he does, but it's also he does that at great, I think, expense to himself in a lot of ways, in that it's he had to give himself over as the perpetually charming guest in order to be in the world and write his work the way he wanted. It wasn't until the end of his life that he's some friends buy him or get a home for him in Switzerland.
Yeah. And the prose work you mentioned earlier is a book on Rilke?
It is.
As I recall. Okay. Anything you want to talk about? Now, I know the single worst question you can ask any writer in any field is, what are you working on next? But I figure, I'll give it a shot here.
Yeah,
Tell me about the book on Rilke.
actually, it's fine. So I am working on this book. It's about it's really about the experience of reading his work during this period, during this year when all of these people in my life were dying. I found that I returned to the Duino elegies, his great kind of modernist masterpiece of 10 poems that he writes over a very long period of time. He starts them, before the First World War and finishes them well after. Maybe 10 years later, he picks them back up again and writes the next group. And there are some that exist in fragments, but there are these poems in which he is the voice of those poems is one that seems almost posthumous. It's a voice that is vatic, that is kind of all-knowing, that seems to be emanating from the other side in some ways. There are many kind of reasons, I think, why that he arrived on that particular voice, but he doesn't sound quite like that in his other poems, and he allows himself to kind of range around. And I found that while I was kind of going through weathering these losses, there were things that I would go to read and to encounter, to try and understand that. And the thing that I love about poems at all, is that, and these poems in particular, is that they felt like worlds that I could enter into and occupy. And reading and rereading a poem like Rilke's First Elegy for me is like going into a house and knowing where everything is, knowing where the furniture is, but also, it's always kind of the light and the atmosphere and all of that is also changing. And those poems to me seem so alive still, but also are speaking about that which is eternal, that which is ongoing, that about kind of the lived life as this small experience, and that what happens after that as being the kind of great experience. And so I wanted to write about that. I wanted to write about the experience of living inside of these poems while this was happening. So it's a little bit of a memoir, and also I hope a kind of literary, I mean, these sort of categories that we use are meaningless to me. I mean, I think it's like I'm a person who reads, and I'm thinking about that, and I'm also a person living a life and writing about that. But I also then decided to go to some of the places where Rilke had lived and to write about those as well. So there's also this sort of travelogue, an aspect of travel that is part of it. And part of it too, I'm thinking about the people who who I'm writing about and kind of memorializing. So, I go to Prague and I go to Stockholm and to Worpswede in northern Germany and to, Austria and I sort of look for, in some ways, the traces of the life that he had lived there and kind of write about it as well. So that's what the book is.
It sounds fantastic. And I have a whole stack of questions left, but the real last question I should ask is, are you willing to come back on the show when the next book comes out so I can ask those?
Oh, of course. Of course.
Awesome. And in person, let's just hope to God by then, we're able to do this in person.
I hope so too.
Mark, thanks so much for coming on the show. This is wonderful. And I enjoyed the hell out of God of Nothingness. And that was Mark Wunderlich. His new poetry collection, God of Nothingness, from Grey Wolf Press, is a haunting piece of work. And maybe that effect is accentuated by reading it in winter, but I found it both austere and gorgeous. I hope you check it out. And follow Mark on Twitter at Mark C. Wunderlich, on Instagram at Mark_Wunderlich, and at his site, markwunderlich.com. And there'll be links to all that in the show and episode notes for this one. But Wunderlich is Wunderlich. Now, in the before time, this is when I would mention my Patreon and PayPal, but we live in a different world now. I'm doing fine financially. So if you want to show support for the podcast, you can do that by sending me a postcard, letter, email. There's even the Google Voice number that I have at 973-869-9659, which you can call into and just tell me what you like and don't like, or who I should interview, or what you think my listeners should be reading or watching or listening to. And I'll include those in upcoming episodes if you give me permission for that. But what I really want you to do, if you have money to spare or even time to volunteer, help out other people. Help out through their Kickstarters, Indiegogos, GoFundMes especially, Patreons, etc. If you're not comfortable giving to individuals, there are foundations and institutions, food banks, freedom funds, a lot of places that can use your help right now. So if you're in a position to help people, then please do. Also, I still have a couple dozen copies of the first issue of my very first zine, Haiku for Business Travelers, available. If you want one, just drop me a line or visit haikuforbusinesstravelers.com and hit me up that way. It's free. You can kick in a few bucks for postage and production if you want, but this is not about making money. It's about me sharing my art, such as it is. I am pretty close to giving up and deciding that number 2 is done, so there might be a second issue on the horizon. I really hope to finish it in the next couple of weeks. Nothing works right for me when I start writing, so what's there might not be as perfect as I'd like, but, again, it's about sharing. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.